Hello all, and this video is going to be a mishmash of different ideas with regards to art and the poetry of one of my favorite artists that I think we had the privilege to have in our lifetime, whose life was unfortunately cut short, Michael Larsen. But so to begin, I guess I wanted to sort of lay out how this video is possible to begin with. I'm going to use the classic hermeneutic interpretation that Heidegger would even use in his own defense of art, with the artist's subjectivity, as we'll examine, doesn't necessarily have to play a significant role in discovering aletheia, especially in the worlds that the artists create. And so just to describe what good art is, to be precise here, good art, especially for Heidegger, is to take into account the sort of ambiguity and mystery that that life brings with being in the world. And so, just like with truth, his example of aletheia, the truth process renders itself through, the questions and dispositions that we bring through our subjectivity into how nature or the truth will reveal itself through objects towards us. It's a very pre-Socratic idea. He loved the pre-Socratics, wanted to bring that back into his philosophy. And so this is how we question how this is objectively considered, and how the truth is revealed through our questioning or nature. And so this, I think, plays into, of course, Heidegger being a Husserlian scholar of the highest order. And Husserl has a lot of interesting dichotomies that he builds in his phenomenological method for for example, like the horizon and the halo of consciousness, which I think will be important for this poetry we're going to look at. And so I want to be as quick as possible so we can get right to it. But one of the interesting ones is the dichotomy of, the physicalism that Husserl is trying to respect and places something like the primary and secondary qualities with Locke, where there's objectiveness with an object, but ultimately our own subjectiveness and how that object will reveal itself through the way we have that in our mental process or consciousness. And so if I were to use an example and not lose the audience here, the perception of one angle of this chair changes in what is called the concatenations of unity. So if I, stand behind this chair and look at it from that angle, I still have the unity of perception that the front of this chair is still here, despite the fact that I've changed my perspective. Or if I go at it from sideways, you can still have that unity within an object despite the fact that you're coming at it from a different sort of horizon. And that's true with all objects, as Husserl would say, with regards to there's always some background. Even though you have the directive of your consciousness, there's always some background unity going on to keep that sort of horizon together, and how the consciousness is able to just fluidly do this for us requires that sort of determined horizon, as he would describe. And so the dichotomy I really want to focus on is the two types of being, of course, in the natural attitude, as Husserl would describe in his arguments, and then also the mental process of actually what the artist does, where they're able to tap into form and these sort of examples, if you will, or models for what they're trying to describe in their art. And so there's the two types of existence, of course, with noumena maybe interesting enough being this sort of physical thing that we subjectively are looking at through the appearances, and then we have the perception through mental process. There's always that phenomenon of objectivity that we'll never be able to reach, which is a really big theme in German philosophy, I think. And so with those kind of dichotomies set out, I think you can enrich what Heidegger's going to do with his own dichotomies in The Origin of Art, which is what I really wanted to get at. And so for Heidegger, there's the dichotomy of the earthly and the world. And so the earthly is sort of like that sort of natural attitude or that natural process. And for Heidegger, it's much more in the sort of mystery of the earthly is always going to get away from the world building of intelligibility. It's always poking out and jetting out and giving new particulars that we're going to have to re-examine and reassess. And so that's something to discuss, to consider with what Heidegger means with the horizon, and these sort of discussion of form and ideals that the artist brings to make intelligible for us. And so that is how, art is much more than just the subjectivity of the actual artist. They're in the eidetic form world. And so for Heidegger, in the Western civilization, as he would describe, there's the world picture, the Western perspective of the subject as the force of how objects are unified in the human subject, sort of creating that sort of objective way we look at things. And of course, off to the side, though, with art itself, and as we'll see in Michael Larsen's poems here, painting perspectivity really gets at this with the perspective, their perspective of a sort of determined horizon, or that sort of determined field, is also able to express at the same time as all these philosophical discussions are going on and theory is going on. We have the artist and their ability to also understand that world picture. And so for Heidegger, with his classification of what these things are in the world, he looks at things from the way we create them in two distinctions with equipment and art. So equipment is something, an object on hand, something like a pair of shoes or something like that, which goes. For Heidegger, these sorts of objects, they just kind of sink into the background unless they're problematized and become an issue. But works of art, or true art, is what he would refer to as a truth event, because it reveals the being of beings and the dialogue that I also think is enriched in that sort of German tradition of understanding that there's no causal mechanisms for a great work of art from an artist that comes out of them. But yet there is this sort of understanding, though, that his own, capacity, his own conduit for Heidegger, an artist is a conduit to that discussion of between a people and what the gods are trying to say. So all works of art take elements or particulars of horizons or a field and reorganizes them into the mystery of life, that existential Heideggerian concept, and taking the earthly and bringing them out in different ways that you can't do with just creating an objectivity of a pair of shoes or something like that, as he describes in The Origin of Art. And so an artist's personal circumstances are trivial and cannot explain the greatness of art and the conduit of that greater process. So now I want to introduce Michael Larsen himself. It was about a 10-minute intro there. I apologize for how long it took, but Michael Larsen himself sadly passed away October 16th, 2010, after what has been described or theorized as an accidental overdose. There's never been conclusive proof. I don't think his mother is going to ever share that sort of information, which is understandable. But Michael Larsen, if you don't know, was famous for stepping onto the battle freestyle competitions, especially with the televised Scribble Jam and Blaze battles on HBO and the turn of the millennium. And then, of course, he had his own albums that had relative success. Basically, if he's one of those gems that once you actually find this artist, you realize how good they actually were, even though they weren't known by everyone. And most people, I think, that has ever been introduced to his music feels more enriched afterwards. Not just because hip hop's really popular, but the richness of the poetry that we'll get into. Which I want to start with the first verse. Of course, I would recommend that you actually listen to the song Color My World Mine, which is what we'll be discussing here. But nonetheless, I'll go through in a very monotone tone with not very good rhythm on some of these lyrics to actually go at what I'm trying to say here. And so he starts the song in verse 1 with, I once met a man who trained himself not to dream. What he seems to have seen was a glimpse of everything. He's been painting pictures on canvas since age 13 and claims he only exists in the mind of a higher being. So right off the bat, you kind of understand that Michael definitely understands to some degree, creativity in the sort of absolute, as Hegel would describe. And so, as you go on with the verse, he describes the painter who paints himself painting himself and all that's in his visual field. I think this ties into how, the artist and perspectivity understood that our human subjectiveness is, giving us in a sort of paradoxical way how we can objectively, look at the world, and you describe that sort of visual field. And he said that was the only way he could make himself real. Ever since he could remember, he had one nightmare reoccur, but until about 10 years ago, it didn't matter. It consisted of loud, distorted sounds echoing off the concrete. He ran on top of it in an attempt to reach a ladder. Now sometimes he'd get so close but never touch his destination, which caused him much frustration because he didn't know what it meant. And by the end of the dream, he saw the scene from a bird's eye, only to witness his dead body laying on the cement. It was only to witness his dead body laying on the cement. Okay, so that was a lot there. And I think what's interesting about this little part here is you can see, this is what's interesting about artists, especially if you take what Heidegger says about the artist. It's not necessarily true that Michael Larsen may have read all of these German idealists that I'm talking about here, but nonetheless, the artist is still in that sort of realm of the being of beings and that sort of discourse, which he's able to describe things that are really precedent to us. So you could see when he talks about the frustration of trying to understand his dream, but also the act of climbing the ladder and not reaching his destination. That's, I think, a description of not being able for us to reach that sort of noumena phenomenon distinction of coming together to a full understanding. There's no full objective understanding. Just as the artist creates a world, an ambiguous one that we can never fully encapsulate entirely. Just like with these poems here, we could go back and we'll have a different viewpoint because it's good art. But I think that the airplane is also really interesting. That there's an airplane in this dream, because I think that there's an implicit awareness here of the airplane being as a sort of symbol of technology, of science and technology, and as this objectifying force, because of course with Heidegger, the artist and science, there's a sort of dichotomy, a tension there that I think is really interesting. So I will continue with the poem here. So he thought it's just a dream and kept living his life, writing his soul on the canvas because it sheds his planet light. And it goes on and on like space and time ain't nothing odd. Alright, so I really wanted to get at that particular passage there because I think that it's interesting that he points out that space and time going on within the artist, and then there's also another thing to note as this first verse ends. It's not that he didn't believe, he just didn't approve of God. His experience was one I couldn't comprehend till I stopped being detective and listened to him as a friend. He said. Alright, so I want to break that down for a second, because I think there's also that sort of Western tradition that Michael's tapped into here with, our civilization, using the airplane, using technology in that objectifying sense, has turned away from God, has even rejected God wholesale, and doesn't even approve of the way in which God has ordered things. At this time period when Firstborn, that's the name of this album, was being recorded, Christopher Hitchens, which was a famous debater and writer for the sort of secular atheist movement at the turn of the century, it wasn't just that he not only rejected God, right? He also went as far as to saying that God is deceptive, even if he was real, and that sort of disapproval, which was something totally different and a totally new phenomenon for us in the West that I don't really think is actually considered enough. But now if we're going to go on to verse 2 here, this is when it gets really interesting. It's like I said, about 10 years ago, the event that changed his whole reality took place on his monthly trip to the local art gallery. It is where he studied his contemporaries and where he nearly carried his sanity to a hole and buried it forever. It was a very mysterious day. The place was almost empty, and he got chills down his spine just being present in the scene. On the wall there was a picture that looked familiar, and when he got it close, his heart stopped, because he saw it was a painting of his dream. It was a painting of his dream, his body on a runway by a ladder to an airplane with its propellers spinning, which accounted for the loud noise. The matchup was perfect, and that was the day he stopped believing it existed. He resented his creator. I mean, words can't explain what must have went on in his brain when he stared into a frame. Okay, so now I want to use that to be the cutoff point. And so I think with verse 2, we're getting at, a lot of existential themes here, which is classic for Michael's poetry. And so verse 2, I think we're getting at the questions of, and the dialogue, certainly with philosophy, of fate and dealing with one's own inevitable death. And so you have that sort of fate and death, and where does freedom lie into that with how this is determined in, he's seeing how he will eventually die, just like we all embrace that we're all going to die one day. So how do we contend with that? Of course, that's a existential question. And And so it's interesting to perhaps consider the philosophy of being with different civilizations, and how they come out in that Hegelian tradition toward being self-conscious within itself. And so there's definitely that sort of classic dichotomy of freedom or indetermination through the artists, by being tapped into the absolute. Who's actually in control here? Is it the artist, or is it the being of beings trying to talk to us? Incidentally, there's a really interesting painting that perhaps Michael was inspired by, with Norman Rockwell's painting, the triple portrait of him painting himself. And so I don't know, I couldn't find the exact quote, but there's that famous quote where I believe it was Rockwell, who he said that he's painting his own happiness, even though he's not actually happy. But I think there's the theme here of the existential dread of you still have to live your life, even if you don't have that sort of complete freedom of indeterminate. There's also something to be said that Michael understands here with aesthetic appreciation and ideas and idealism, away from this sort of physical, natural attitude, is a higher calling, a higher spirit, and so that sort of self-creativity of the world is also interesting to look at here. So I want to continue on with verse 2. I mean, words can't explain what must have went on in his brain when he stared into a frame of a work of art which he created and was at the same time. The mind can't handle that much. It's just insane. It's like reading a book where each words describe your thoughts, and in quotations it reads whatever you say when you talk. You think it can't happen, but it did happen. I guess there's surprisingly wide cracks in each life sidewalk. He stumbled upon an answer when he never had a question, and decided to stop dreaming to maintain his mental health. Now he hardly talks to people, just stays in his basement, writing infinity by painting himself. So this just described, I might have went a little ahead here, but what I just said in my dialogue of, living your, the examined life, as it were, and, actually taking action and not just taking in this sort of information. So as he continues here, and this will kind of tie it in, this is a strange universe. Is it all just a blueprint? Is the real universe, in the real universe, is my consciousness useless? Are we really something a higher intelligence made up, a figment of imagination colored by a cosmic paintbrush? Maybe all of our art creates the fate of other beings. Then every character in every novel thinks it's alive and we're just gods, ruling blindly, just a theory. I don't know what it means, but that's the story of the man who trained himself not to dream. Okay, so as we wrap up here with these amazing verse here, there's that sort of, again, tradition of, the world is intelligibility in Heidegger's essay, and the earth resisting and still bringing out mystery, wonder within art that takes particulars or things within the world and illuminates the ambiguity or meaning in the mystery of it. So that's hence when he says just a theory, I don't know what it means. And then there's also that wrapping around with the absolute spirit. Creating the world, a God creating the God, which gives us that sort of objective towards aletheia or truth through those aesthetics. There's a theme of Schopenhauer here with that all is art. That's what he actually says at one point in the song. It's actually kind of muffled in the background, which is it's really interesting to consider that the hidden variable that all is art, aesthetic arrest for Schopenhauer is what is the higher being, getting away from that visceral natural attitude. And so, what did Michael Larsen do here? He did the act of creating a new world for us, for this video to be possible for me to interpret, to then be a world for you to interpret. And thus, as he finishes in the hook here, famously, he once saw a painting that told his whole life story. He witnessed the paradox of the word existing. He once saw a painting that told his whole life story. He colored his world theirs and concluded he wasn't living. He once saw a painting that told his whole life story, the hidden variable that all that is art. And when I close my eyes, I see eternity as a story. A God imagined the God that imagined me, and I am God, and so on, and so on, and so on. So yeah, he wraps this up here with that, idea of, the artist creates the world within the worlds. Just as Heidegger says, there's the being of beings that comes out that's, trying to make intelligible to us. The artist is the dialogue between God and his people. And that's why, there's no real causal explanation for, why we come around to aesthetics at certain times. It's because, there's a being, the being of beings is trying to communicate with us. So yeah, hopefully you guys really enjoyed this post. Like I said, I think Michael Larsen's poetry is very rich and very interesting to look at right now in the world, as well as looking at Heidegger's thoughts on art and what good art should actually be. It's something that I think is interesting for people perhaps in the scene to consider with aesthetics and art. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Enjoy the music if you haven't before, and make sure to subscribe, and I will be back with lectures on Heidegger with Being and Time. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy.